Good evening and welcome to Vantage Point. Here on the program, we take a step back from the usual news reporting and take a look at the stories making headlines here at home. We talk about issues that really matter to the people, and we highlight the shortcomings or the weaknesses on the part of the politicians, and also how we as a country can improve and move forward. Joining again with me on the show is Dr. Dayan, Jayatilleka, a former diplomat and a political analyst. Thank you very much for joining us, Doctor.
Good evening, Mahina.
Good evening. Now, I said we have this show mainly to talk about the problems affecting the people, to give the people an in-depth or intellectual analysis of the day-to-day headline-making stories that they see on the newspaper or even on the news, on television and on radio. Taking a look back at the events that have transpired within this couple of days, starting from last week, the center of attention has been the Gampa district, where we saw a public demonstration that started off with a fast by a monk demanding that a solution be provided to the drinking water crisis in Ratupaswala and 12 villages in surrounding areas. The demonstration escalated and we saw loss of life, and this has been, in the midst of much controversy. What is your take on the situation that has led up to the protests and what we saw last week?
Mahina, the protest was on an extremely fair and just issue. It's a fundamental human right to have clean, drinkable or potable, as they say, water. This didn't spring out of nowhere. This has been an ongoing protest campaign. It is not led by, it's not limited to university students or the usual suspects, FUTA or whatever. These are the citizens of that area. Every religion, every age group, grandmothers, mothers, fathers, kids. A civic surge of opinion. Now, what we saw leading to the loss of life was not an escalation of the protest. It was an escalation of the reaction to the protest. What we saw was something quite extraordinary. There is no state of emergency in the country. There is no invocation of the Public Securities Ordinance because there is no emergency in the country. In such a situation where the normal law prevails, what were heavily armed military units doing in Gampa? That's the basic question, because the role of the military is to defend the country and its borders from external enemies and from armed threats, organized armed threats within. Now, there was no organized armed threat in Valley area,
which was the center of the demonstration.
Anywhere in Gampa.
We saw people coming onto the streets and they were obstructing the roads, especially the Kandy Road, Colombo Kandy Road, creating a lot of traffic congestion there, but they were engaging in a peaceful protest.
Absolutely, and there were men, women and children. In such circumstances, the protocols are very clear. In fact, a senior police official said, look, I didn't try to clear this. I could have baton charged, I could have used water cannon, I didn't, because this was a fair and just protest which was going on for a long time. And he said that there had been a negotiated outcome with the Secretary to the Ministry of Defence, and that the people were unable to benefit from that outcome because some other agitators had proceeded to block the road. Now, even so, what is important is that the senior police official does not say that he tried to move the crowd and that he could not do it and that the crowd got violent and therefore he had to call for heavily armed military intervention. No, he didn't say that. The military comes in, Mahina, only if in any country the police and the specialized riot police cannot handle the situation. Furthermore, in Gampa there is an STF camp. The STF was not deployed and they didn't have to retreat in the face of violent protest. Now it's only in that situation that in any civilized democracy you call out the army. But we saw on camera that army units with body armor were deployed in broad daylight. Body armor and T-56 automatic weapons. The T-56 is not a riot control weapon. It's an assault rifle. You use that to fight tigers. You don't use that when you go into Gampa. Now, who took the decision? Under what law, constitutional authority to send specialized army units with senior officers equipped with body armor, buffalo armored cars, and armed with T-56 assault weapons with live ammunition into a crowd control situation where there were men, women, and children? Who took the decision? That is the fundamental question. Under what authority? What, without emergency being declared? And why? Now, I've heard the story about Molotov cocktails. Now, every newspaper reporter says that the people admit that once they were fired on by the army, some young people tried to retaliate using sticks and stones and rags soaked in petrol. Now, there are no reports of any casualties as a result of Molotov cocktails. There are reports of casualties from gunshot injuries. There are bullet holes in the walls of the church. So it's not as if the kids who were throwing Molotov cocktails started it. And it's not as if the Molotov cocktails caused any fatalities. If you have army troops in flak jackets, body armor, carrying T-56s, and the other guys have, I don't know, slippers, stones, and some petrol bombs, that's not a clash. Now, the question would arise then, what do you do if you're faced with people who are, blocking the roads and so on? Well, it's very easy. You have...
I mean, we've seen this sort of situations around the world.
All
we've
over
seen
the
in
world.
London, we've seen even in the US, we saw people getting onto the streets when the economy was bad. But how can we learn from those situations?
You use the police. I mean, in London, they didn't call the army out. There was rioting. There was looting. In the United States, even in the 60s, they would call out the National Guard. The equivalent would have been the STF. And that's when there were snipers firing from rooftops. That's when they called the National Guard out. There were no snipers firing from rooftops on the part of the protesters, certainly, in Gampa. So, what you do is, you have a graduated escalation. That's what any normal democratic country does. And you use minimum force. So you use water cannon to disperse the crowds, baton charge, tear gas. There's a strong tear gas called CS gas. And if you still cannot disperse the crowd, there is a very well known, long established category of weapons that you use, which are known as riot guns. A riot gun is a repeater pump shotgun which is not filled with 12 gauge buckshot, which you use to kill animals, but which has bird shot. That's 16 gauge or 20 gauge. It peppers you with pellets. Riot guns were not used here.
But tear gas and water cannons were used. That's what senior police spokespersons and media officials said, that water cannons and the tear gas was used to disperse protesters.
Yeah. Well, it's. I suppose the protesters should be lucky. After weeks of agitating for clean water, they got some of it off the water cannon. But after that, the next step is to use riot guns if you need to. That is, the riot control shotgun with bird shot. You don't escalate to T-56 assault rifles, which the troops were sent in with by 5 o'clock that evening, because we saw it. What were they doing in body armor? Who did they think they were taking on? Who sent them into that situation with automatic weapons? That's a fundamental breakdown. A fundamental breakdown. Sri Lanka is not under martial law. There is no call to send heavily armed troops with armored personnel carriers. The armored personnel carriers were there the next day as well. I mean, it looked like a place under occupation. This is not under occupation. The role of the armed forces is to defend society, to defend the people. The ancient Romans, the classical Romans, asked the question, who will guard the guardians? And they were very wise people. And that was a fundamental question. And the army is supposed to guard society, not rule it. And the Romans asked, who will guard the guardians? So maybe now we have to ask, who will defend us from the defense authorities?
But then some may actually argue, or there can be arguments put forth, that the people would have agitated. The people would have come forward and the clashes would have escalated to a point where there was no choice but to get in the military to intervene in the situation. So it can be argued in either way.
How? Because the people didn't agitate to the point where the military had to be called in. The military was sent in at 5 o'clock. The military was already there when the people were milling around. Why? It is not as if the police had been pushed back and the riot police pushed back and then they called for military help. The clashes didn't take place before the military got there. The military said, we are going to push you, and they said it on television. The people didn't push the military. The military pushed the people. The military was deployed before it got anything like out of control. The only element that was out of control there was the military, and whoever decided to send the military in, not the people. The people tried to defend themselves in any way possible with whatever little they had. The timeline is clearly established because there's television footage. Who sent the military in first? We didn't see the police battling with the protesters, water cannon, trying to chase them off. Then these guys come back, they throw Molotov cocktails. Then somebody calls for the military to come and help us. No. We saw the military in there in daylight. In body armor. Against whom? Carrying T-56s, hoping to do what? With women and children there? I mean, it's a fundamental... There's a famous story of the legendary French diplomatic genius Talleyrand during the period of... he served the French Revolution and Napoleon and so on.